All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the NAM Center noon lecture. This is my first time doing the introduction for the NAM Center. My name is Kyotaro Tsutsui. I'm a faculty member in the Sociology department and director of the Human Rights Initiative. And Human Rights Initiative is delighted to co-host this event. I was asked to make a few announcements. One, please turn off your cell phone. Two, the lecture will end around 5 p.m. and the presentation by the speaker will end around 5 p.m. and then we'll have 10, 15, 20 minutes of Q&A. And the colloquium, NAM Center colloquium series will feature, will happen again next time on February 10th. The speaker is Kyun-Dok Roh. The topic is Yalta Conference and the Division of the Korean Peninsula. Yep. And there will also be an event from March 17th to 20th, The Art of Korean Papermaking. Okay. And for both of those events, announcements, brochures are there. So please pick them up if you're interested. Okay. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jeong-Woo, who is an old friend of mine and collaborator on a lot of things, most importantly the Korea-Michigan Human Rights Exchange Program. There was an information session this afternoon, and I understand some of you have participated in it. It's a collaborative endeavor between the Human Rights Initiative here and the Sungkyunkwan University, where Professor Koo is at, and we send 2 students each year to Sungkyunkwan University to spend a few weeks in summer to take intensive human rights course and do some research on human rights in Korea. It's a very interesting program. So if you're interested, please check. I guess we don't have the handout. Please check the website. If you go to Human Rights Initiative Michigan, you will find that information. Okay. Professor Jeong-Woo is associate professor at the Sungkyunkwan University Department of Sociology. He was the chair of the department until recently. Somehow he got out of it, and this year he's spending a year at the Harvard Yencheon Institute at Harvard University as visiting scholar. He's a prominent political sociologist in Korea, a leading figure in the study of human rights in Korea. He runs the prestigious Social Science Korea Human Rights Forum, and I'm fortunate to be a part of that group. He has a PhD in sociology at Stanford University, and he has published widely in various different journals, such as Korean Journal of Sociology, Social Forces, Human Rights Quarterly, Sociology of Education, many top outlets in sociology. He has published a couple books, and today he is here to talk about contentious diffusion of human rights, evidence from South Korean print media, 1990 to 2010. It's a relatively new project, as I understand it, so I'm sure he would appreciate your feedback. Okay, so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Koo.
Thanks for generous introduction, Kyo. It's always good to see you. It's a good friend of mine, and we share the same theoretical perspective, and we belong to the same research team. We share research resources, and so on and so forth. It's actually my first time to come to Ann Arbor, to come to Michigan, even though I spent in total about 9 years in the United States, 3 years in Atlanta, Georgia, and 6 years in San Francisco, where I completed my PhD at Stanford. But for some reason, I don't understand why it had to be the first time to be in the University of Michigan. But I'm so glad to be here, and I'm just looking at so many good people, wonderful places for food, and wonderful campus, huge but beautiful campus. So far it's been quite enjoyable. But the most important thing is to deliver this talk. That's the whole reason why I'm here. Today, I'm going to share with you some of many research projects unfolding at this point. And one of the papers actually I have submitted to a journal is under review at some journal. So, but probably Kyo is one of the reviewers. So you never know. You let me know, right? You should if you get the paper from the journal. So this is under review. So I would really appreciate your feedback and comment on any aspects of the paper and presentation. All right. Since the Second World War II, human rights have emerged as an instrumental international norm and have shaped the behaviors of nation states, organizations, and individuals. We now have an elaborate system of human rights protection system spearheaded by the United Nations, and which is made up of conventions, monitoring organizations, and special procedures. And then the United Nations Human Rights Protection System is strongly aided by thousands of human rights NGOs operating at the global level. And many of them actually have consultative status with ECOSOC, the Economic Social Council within the United States, United Nations. So there is interesting collaboration between NGOs and the United Nations. Along with that, nation states and countries around the world have endorsed human rights conventions, and then they have participated in the human rights agencies, including the Human Rights Council, where they have memberships, and to fulfill their requirements as the member of the Human Rights Council, as well as adopting so many kinds of human rights organizations, including the Human Rights Commission and the Truth Commissions. And then many countries, as demonstrated by a group of scholars associated with Stanford University, demonstrated that so many countries around the world have cared about how to teach about human rights education. So have elaborately incorporated human rights education components to the mass education. And not to mention that companies also care about human rights norms and ethics. So as Kyo studied, the United Nations Global Compact and the ways in which companies care about human rights norms. At Harvard University, there is a candidate school, and there are so many prominent human rights scholars, and one of them is John Ruggie, and who was appointed as a special representative of the United Nations. And his job was to work on, very important policy projects that addresses responsibilities of corporations in terms of human rights obligations. So taken together, it is so obvious that human rights became, widespread and global norms around the world. In response, South Korea also has participated in the global campaign of the promotion of human rights. So far, South Korea has adopted and ratified 7 out of 9 major human rights conventions, except the Convention on Migrant Workers and Their Families and the Convention on Disappearance. So except these 2 conventions, South Korea has committed to being part of the global campaign for the promotion of human rights by ratifying 7 major human rights conventions. South Korea also has been quite faithful in fulfilling its duties and obligations to submit country reports to respond to inquiries from the international organizations, including the monitoring bodies. And in 2001, South Korea also adopted the National Human Rights Commission, whose function is to explicitly devoted to the promotion and protection of human rights. And every year, the commission receives tens of thousands of individual complaints and investigate on the cases and make recommendations for correcting potential human rights abuses. In 2005, South Korea also established a Truth Commission, whose function is to investigate on the past human rights abuses and then produce a major policy report regarding what led to mass killings or mass human rights abuses in the past. And then if you look at the public polls regarding South Korean public's attitude toward human rights, it turns out more than 50% of the South Korean are quite familiar with the human rights situation in South Korea. So South Korea also became the part of the larger campaign of the promotion of human rights. In response, so many scholars, in particular scholars from sociology and political science, other than law, emerged and sought to explain what led to the global expansion of human rights, the global diffusion of human rights from diverse perspectives and approaches. In particular, a group of sociologists as well as political scientists has developed a theoretical framework called a diffusion theory. And Kyo is really familiar with that. And I quoted Kyo's work up there. The crux of the diffusion literature is that there exists a modern cultural system that encourages more participation and capacities and responsibilities of individual persons, okay, as opposed to nation states and other collective entities. And then the cultural system naturally gave rise to the global human rights regime, where the emphasis is on the roles of individuals and their capacities to put forward their claims and arguments about human rights abuses and the ways in which human rights can be better protected. And then the regime subsequently has a huge impact on national policies and national identities. So basic idea is driven by the top-down reform that is rooted in what happens at the global level. And then it has an impact on national policies and national cultures and identities. That this is the basic model that centers around the diffusion literature. There have been 3 responses to the literature of the human rights diffusion. One is about decoupling, which means potential discrepancies between human rights ideals, the diffusion of human rights ideals, and what is happening on the ground. So many scholars demonstrated the existence of the gap between the adoption of the ideas and still rampant human rights abuses on the ground. Second response was to conceptualize and reconceptualize the human rights diffusion by addressing the aspect of vertical intensification. The key idea is that diffusion scholars actually primarily looked at norm setting, the standard setting, and the diffusion of the standards set, as opposed to looking into, for example, investigation of the human rights abuses and holding human rights perpetrators responsible for those abuses. So those scholars argue that we need to add not only norm settings, but also investigation and accountability. So that's a second line of thought and response. The third response concerns the emphasis on local responses, the roles of local, national law and local practices, the role of national players and actors like local NGOs and etc. So without taking into account what happens at the local level, like local culture and local social institutions, etc., you cannot really explain what happens in terms of the diffusion of human rights. For me, I was so much inspired by the third line of thought, even though I just like I trust, I believe in the strength of the diffusion literature, but it needs to be strengthened by taking into account the local context and local responses. So the key argument in my paper is that the diffusion of human rights inevitably entails contestation or conflict. The diffusion is not so much of straightforward or smooth process of the diffusion. It inevitably it is accompanied by so many conflicts and challenges from local actors. So the diffusion literature can be benefited from taking into account different ways in which contestation takes place. So here's my take, the other way of visualizing and conceptualizing the conventional literature, the diffusion model. It starts from the global emergence, which is about the standard setting and norm setting at the global level, spearheaded by the United Nations, for example. And then that model is accepted and adopted by the national authorities, and national incorporation takes place. So a lot of laws are drafted, and then institutions are established in response to the adoption of international human rights norms. And Human Rights Commission is one of many examples. And then ending with the institutionalization of human rights, meaning human rights become taken for granted. Human rights are considered as legitimate norms and social practices. So that's the cycle, basically, according to the conventional diffusion model. It's just like it starts from the global emergence, and it goes around and going through the national incorporation phase, and also going further into the institutionalization phase. And then institutional phase ends, the second round of global emergence takes place, kicks off. It just like, yeah. Here is what I visualize with the framework of the contentious diffusion model as an alternative model to the human rights diffusion model. The first three phases remain the same. Global emergence, just pushing national incorporation of human rights, and ending with institutionalization. But that's actually not the end of the story. There are more stories involved, more dynamic, intriguing processes are there, okay? Taking over the phase of institutionalization, which involves, one, scrutinization. So many international human rights standards come under very careful scrutiny by governments and NGOs and political conservatives, and so on and so forth. And then that leads to conflict-laden process of the diffusion that gives rise to a lot of conflicts and contestations. So I'm going to show you the examples of contestations by looking at the ways in which Korean print media report about human rights. There has been so many conflicts and contestations between liberal newspaper outlets and conservative newspaper outlets. So in that way, I thought that I can reframe and supplement the diffusion literature based on the Korean example of the media coverage of human rights. Here are three major primary research questions I pose. One is, how do human rights expand and diffuse based on the Korean example? Two, what happens at a later point in the human rights diffusion regarding the fourth and fifth phases of scrutinization and contestation? Finally, why and how do human rights become contentious? But because of time constraint, I have only 15 minutes. Already 15 minutes have passed. I would primarily focus on how question as opposed to why question to demonstrate human rights discourse became so much contentious. And then if you have questions about what led to contestation of human rights, I'd be happy to address that during Q&A. Okay, here are the three daily newspapers I examined in this paper. I examined the three newspapers and quoted 2,134 articles that mention about human rights, as well as several other terms that have high implications in terms of human rights. For example, I considered sexual minorities and migrant labor, right to survival, right to labor, domestic violence, discrimination against women. The reason why I also considered those articles with these terms was that by excluding those articles, because they don't even mention about human rights, I would mistakenly exclude crucial newspapers that have a lot of implications in terms of human rights. But if you count the number of articles, I would say 95% of the articles I examined contain the term of human rights in the newspaper articles. Joseon daily newspaper, I think many of them would be really familiar with those three news outlets. Joseonilbo is the most widely circulated news outlet. Daily 1.7 million copies are published in South Korea by Joseon daily newspaper, followed by Donga daily newspaper. 0.9 million, 900,000 copies are published. And then Hangyeoldae newspaper. If you look at the volume of circulation, it remains fairly low compared with the other two major outlets, but only like 0.3 million copies. But if you consider the prestige and impact of the outlet, oftentimes Hangyeoldae is considered as one of the most reliable a source of newspapers in South Korea. And then not to mention that Hangyeoldae represents a liberal political perspective. In that way, we can engage in comparison between newspapers with different political orientations. Okay. The figure gives you what happened in terms of the diffusion of human rights in South Korea, looking into the number of articles with human rights on their headlines. The line in purple shows you the total number of newspapers published over time, and then which is broken into three different newspapers. Joseon in blue, Donga in green, Hangyeoldae in red. As you can see here, from 1990, the beginning year of my observation, and up to 2005, except the downward trends in 2000 and 2001, it just basically goes up. The volume of newspaper coverage goes up. It was in rise fairly rapidly. But from 2005 to 6, it began to go down. The number of articles goes down. And what does it mean? That's an important question to ask. I'm going to address that shortly. Throughout the observation period, Hangyeoldae took the lead in reporting about human rights, right? The line in red. But as time went on, it was also picked up by other conservative major newspaper outlet. But moving to the mid and end of the 2000s, it is so obvious. It is so evident that the number of human rights covering newspaper articles goes down. All right. And then the reason why we saw the rise in in the volume in 1999 was because of the adoption of the National Human Rights Commission in South Korea, raising the awareness of the public regarding the importance of human rights. And EPS represents employment permit system, which is a system that allows migrant workers to enjoy more rights and to have better protection in employment, and allowing migrant workers to stay in South Korea for up to 5 years. Okay? And then that was encouraging more attention to human rights. And then there was one ethics in 2005 that was associated with North Korea. In 2005, North Korea admitted to having nuclear program, and then it invited really critical criticisms from the international community. And then many people called attention to human rights situation in North Korea. So that is why we saw the epics of the volume of human rights in 2005. From now on, I'm going to show you a table that contains more substantive materials within the newspaper articles I examined. First of all, I sort of used the basic scheme. The first scheme starts from the themes, and then the second scheme is topics, and the third is issues. I was looking at the three major topics. One, civil and political rights. Two, economic, social, and cultural rights. And three, the human rights regime, which is broken up into 15 larger topics, as you can see here, and then which is further broken into about 45 issues that detail substantive issues of human rights. For example, like death penalty is one of examples of civil and political rights. And then conscientious objectors. South Korean young people are required to go to the army, but it is entirely possible that some of young people refuse to go to the army because going to the army and confronting people would go against the person's religious belief. If that's the case, something happens and then they have to go to jail because they don't fulfill the duty they need to bear. Economic, social, and cultural rights, and there's many examples of topics and labor rights and right to welfare, right to education, human rights to education, and then rights of social minorities like migrants and refugees and women, children, the elderly, etc. And then the human rights regime mainly deals with the international human rights protection system, and then the regional as well as international human rights regimes. And also, it also includes the roles of NGOs and international non-governmental organizations. Okay, the table I showed you comes down to the issue of diversification of human rights in South Korea. This figure gives you the number of human rights issues covered in the media over time, okay, the second category. And as you can see here, except again the years of 2000 and 2001, the trend is so obvious. It goes up gradually. So demonstrating the topics of human rights become diversified and expanded. But again, moving to the most recent years, 2008, 2009, 2010, it doesn't become diverse anymore. It brings up the other implication we'll visit shortly. The table also gives you ideas about how different kinds of human rights theme contest with each other over time. The items of human rights issues, first, civil and political rights issues are marked with red, and economic, social, and cultural rights with blue color, and human rights regime in green. So as of 1990, by the time when South Korea began to accept international human rights regime, the topic was predominantly about the human rights regime, okay, the United Nations Human Rights Protection System, etc. We only saw a small number of topics that address economic and social rights. But as time goes on, if you look at, for example, like 1993, 1995, 1996, we look at topics in blue. There are so many issues with the blue, meaning that as time goes on, the South Korean media as well as South Korean public became much more interested in economic, social, and cultural rights as opposed to human rights regime and civil and political rights. So it demonstrates a potential shift of emphasis in South Korea from civil and political rights to economic, social, and cultural rights. That would never happen in this country because American public believes that human rights are primarily about civil and political rights as opposed to economic and social rights. So it is dramatic contrast if you consider the South Korean example. Okay, here I provide the 5 different administrations over time from 1990 to 2010. President Roh Tae-woo, the dictator, military soldier, and Kim Young-sam, the first civilian president, and Kim Dae-jung, the Nobel Peace Laureate, and who was a strong human rights defender, advocate, and followed by Roh Moo-hyun, who unfortunately killed himself, and who also kept on the reforms that was initiated by Kim Dae-jung and to bring about a lot of social changes to do reforms in terms of democracy and human rights. And then Lee Myung-bak, a conservative president, just like a predecessor of current President Park Geun-hye. One thing you can note from this figure is that as time goes on, again, economic, social, and cultural rights become more prominent as opposed to civil and political rights in red. Okay, and then the percentage of the coverage of the human rights regime remains fairly constant. Okay, now I'm gonna shift my emphasis to the contestation part. So far, I've shown you the fact that human rights became widespread and diffused and diversified, and then even there was a shift from civil and political rights to economic and social and cultural rights. But from now on, I'm going to show you some evidence regarding, the fact that human rights became more and more contested in South Korea. Here, what I did was to look at the tones of the newspaper articles examined. 3 major tones. 1, positive tone. 2, negative tone. And 3, mixed tones. With respect to the mixed tones, what I mean is that it's hard to figure out. The author is in favor of human rights, or the person is not in favor of human rights, or sometimes is supportive of human rights, but on other parts is very critical of human rights. It's hard to determine the primary tone of the article. Over time, the positive tone in green, is the biggest and the largest over time. But you can note that the length of the bar in green has been shrinking over time, giving way to the newspaper articles with either mixed or negative. Note this, the bar in red represents the number of articles with negative tones toward human rights. And it's not that substantial, but it it increases over time. Here's the other way of looking at the same pattern. Just basically the difference is that it considers the proportion of the articles to give you a better idea of what happened, to grasp what happened. Again, over time, moving to the mid 2000s and the end of 2000s, it is very clear that the majority is not the positive tone driven articles. The majority is either articles with mixed tones or the articles with negative tones. Okay? So demonstrating, somehow, human rights become more and more contentious over time. All right. Now, I'm going to share with you some of the excerpts to give you a better idea about how human rights coverage became contentious over time. There are two presidents. Is there anyone who knows about who's who? The first one? Okay. Lo and Jeong-Woo. Jeong-Woo was the also dictator who disrupted democracy in South Korea, and then just like through a military coup and maintained authoritarian sort of regime, and then he gave his power to Roh Tae-woo, who used to be the retired four-star general. He took over the position of Jeong-Woo. And then people were concerned about what would happen under the leadership of Roh Tae-woo, because he was a former retired military general. People were suspicious about the administration, worried about the possibility that human rights would be abused under his presidency. So if you look at the tone, it goes like this. Like President Roh Tae-woo announced that all the unjust laws and tortures should disappear, and all the conscientious prisoners would be released. But the fact is that the number of arrests of political dissidents is higher than in the previous regime. We strongly request that the government, if they want to show the world its will for democratic reforms, it should abolish all the unjust laws, such as national security law. So if you look at the tone, it's like it's in favor of human rights and pressuring the government to abide by the international human rights norms. Here's the other president who took the office after President Roh Tae-woo, who is President Kim Yong-sam. Who was the first civilian president. Korea never saw the civilian president until Kim Yong-sam took the office from 1993 to 1997. Here the focus was a little bit different because Kim Yong-sam was the first civilian president, so that the expectation was that he would better respect human rights and then consider democracy in national policies, so that the tone had to be, in general, positive, still being supportive of human rights, demanding the government to take into account human rights. Some excerpt. Kim Yong-sam emphasizes that they, as the first civilian government, they are distinguished from the previous military regimes. Amnesty International pointed out that 500 political prisoners are still in jail. Kim administration adopted 세계화, meaning globalization, as a national motto, but it sounds empty. It doesn't still respect human rights. That's why we still looking at the existence of more than 500 political prisoners in the country. So here also critical of the government and asking, pressuring the government to respect human rights. And then now we move to the era of President Kim Dae-jung, who was a Nobel laureate and who used to be sentenced to death because of his career for the promotion of democracy and human rights. And here, what's important is about the adoption of the National Human Rights Commission, and to what extent we need to give power and mandates for the Human Rights Commission. Okay? And then the other controversy revolves around how to deal with the North Korean human rights and the ways in which the Commission addresses human rights in North Korea. This is one of the quotes. The reporter said, "I agree that it is appropriate to give the Human Rights Commission, it's messed up, sorry, National Human Rights Commission of South Korea to investigate human rights violations by the state authorities, such as police and prosecutors, but we need to reconsider its right to investigate discrimination, such as racial or sexual discriminations. We shouldn't allow the commission to investigate on discriminations. It's way too far. It just crossed the line. It doesn't work for our national interests. Eradicating racism is important, but we need to consider first why we are using foreign workers. So you got to be careful in terms of extending the mandates of the Human Rights Commission. It is becoming controversial here. Regarding North Korean human rights, for a long time, the Commission, after a long, fierce debate, the Commission released a statement criticizing the government decision to dispatch South Korean troops to Iraq. By sending more troops to Iraq. However, the reporter has never heard about the Commission had any debate or hearing to discuss human rights abuses occurring in North Korea. I hope that they have a more balanced discussion about human rights of our brothers in North Korea. So it was the first time in the year of 2003, the public media and the political circles in South Korea began to, alarm human rights authorities to pay attention to what's happening in North Korea. Okay, this is a commission established in South Korea, but according to the national constitution of South Korea, people living in North Korean people are also South Korean citizens. That's what the national constitution stipulates. So because of that, we always need to pay attention to what's happening in North Korea, human rights abuses.
So was that coded as negative or?
Yeah, this is coded negative. Yeah. I think in that case, I need to go back and recheck my coding book and the data. I think it's got to be more mixed. It's got to be more mixed. It's hard to determine. But yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. It's basically supportive of human rights, but when it comes to the ways that Commission deals with North Korean human rights issues, it's critical. So that's an example of a mixed tone of a article. Sorry about that. But taken together, I would argue that the contestation has taken the three major forms, more conceptually. One, the justification goes like this. There are other urgent issues to address in this country other than human rights cause. For example, national security and maintaining social order. Okay? We need to be able to accept more migrant workers, but we also need to keep an eye on national integrity because South Korea for a long time has maintained homogeneous society based on same ancestry and blood. So, accepting many foreign workers and refugees or foreign migrants would be considered as a threat to the national security and social order of the country. So, social human rights might be an important standard and norm, but there are so many other norms we should also respect. So that's one way to approach human rights. That's one way that makes human rights more contentious. The second form is about whether some issues are qualified as human rights. Let me take an example. In the early 2000s, South Korea was trying to pass the Anti-Discrimination Law, Anti-Discrimination Act, that is designed to protect the rights of social minorities, like including homosexuals and sexual minorities, and women, children, elderly, and migrant workers, etc. But there was a heated debate regarding to what extent we should allow people with different sexual orientations to enjoy their human rights. Is it qualified as human rights? Gays and lesbians and LGBT in general, should we say that the kinds of rights they have are human rights? Maybe, maybe not, that there was controversy. So many people, mostly conservative as well as evangelical folks, argued that in general, human rights are given as human beings. It's not acquired, it's given. But if you consider gays and lesbians, their characteristics is attained as opposed to be given from God or nature. So these are not qualified as human rights. The third form of contestation involves human rights versus human rights. There's so many human rights, but it's hard to say that one is more important than the other. So there are so many situations in which you see the situation in which it's hard to figure out which rights needs to receive more attention than the others. So this is the third form. Because of time constraint, I'm going to show you two examples demonstrating human rights versus human rights and how that issue leads to intensify the contestation of human rights discourse. The first one is about students' rights versus teachers' rights. Okay. Couple of years ago, many educators and policymakers trying to pass legislation requiring the ways in which we respect students' rights in schools. Like, we should be careful with regulating students' hairstyle, regulating their clothes, and checking their diaries, things like that. That happened conventionally in South Korea for a long time. Even checking diaries of students and regulating the length of hair and regulating the style of clothing, etc. But all of a sudden, these things considered as potential human rights abuses. So it's the time to consider students' rights and just like wiping out the regulations, unfair regulations put in place, strongly advocating students' rights. But sooner rather than later, it invited criticism from a lot of people in South Korea. Wait a minute, if you allow too much for students' rights, it would shrinken teachers' rights. Okay? Teachers need to have the proper means through which they can discipline kids. That might include corporal punishment. They might include proper regulations put in place. Okay, it's hard to figure out. So conservative newspapers began to talk a lot about bringing up the issues of teachers' rights and why it's not fair to exclusively focus on students' rights. So this is one of the causes. This is really interesting. Since Human Rights Commission emphasized human rights of students, since then, students frequently defy teachers' rights in the name of human rights, and as a result, teachers face difficulties in managing their classes. Their decisions violate teachers' rights, ignoring teacher professionalism and autonomy. So this is a typical article you can see in Joseon or Donga daily newspapers, making human rights increasingly contentious. The second example might be about offenders' rights versus victims' rights. As you can recall, in South Korea as well as in other parts of the world, including the United States, there are so many serial killers, and their crime makes their way to headlines, and then for some period, to be able to respect the rights of criminal suspects, what the police did was to put masks and what is that? Put masks and hoods on the criminal suspects to respect their potential rights, because there is a chance that it turns out they might be innocent, not guilty, invoking the presumption of innocence. But it invited criticism from the public. Why is it that we protect the rights of criminal suspects who are so obviously criminal offenders, right? So we shouldn't put caps or masks on the criminal suspects if what they did was absolutely criminal, especially serial killers. And then we also need to consider the rights of victims as opposed to rights of criminal suspects. We should keep the more balanced perspectives regarding how to protect, on one hand, offenders' rights and the victims' rights. So when we talk about human rights, we focus on protecting human rights of defendants. While human rights of offenders were improved and guaranteed in the investigation and adjudication process, victims still have to cope with their emotional and physical scars all by themselves. So in response, the Ministry of Justice put in place several programs designed to provide help for criminal victims and their families, okay, who lost their family members, who got really traumatized after they saw the scene of the crime. So the victims also have the human rights, so which needs to be prioritized. That's tough. So that gives rise to the contention. Okay, so because we're running out of time, let me talk about the implications and some of the discussions I think crucial to move forward. One implication of my research, after showing you the diffusion of human rights and the contestation of human rights in South Korea, the implication is that it gives you some theoretical framework as to why there have been widespread cynicism regarding human rights in many parts of the world. My favorite example is about the refugee crisis in European countries. And many countries, European countries, seek to tighten their borders to stop the flocking of asylum seekers and refugees, and arguing that we also need to protect our national security. We need to protect our borders. Human rights is crucial, but probably national security needs to come to the fore as opposed to human rights. And then, as you can guess, but because of global terrorism and global anti-terrorism, and then ISIS crisis, attack, and all those kinds of human rights abuses and violence, there has been sort of slowing down of the spread of democracy and human rights. That's what scholars demonstrate and argue these days. The level of human rights and democracy goes down. It has lost forward momentum. So if you examine so many international indicators on democracy and human rights, and the global average of the protection of democracy and human rights is in decline substantially. Okay? So it further strengthening the motivation of cynicism. People become very critical of human rights. Okay? It's the time to consider other values at this point. Because my model argues that the diffusion of human rights inevitably entails the contentious phases and conflicts. So there might be moments in which the taken for granted values of human rights would get challenged. Their meanings would be challenged, and their boundaries would be reinterpreted and renegotiated. So my model, contentious diffusion model, has implications for explaining what's happening around the world. Second, I think regarding the model advocated by the scholars, my model would be able to supplement and enrich the diffusion literature rather than replacing the diffusion literature. My model will be able to supplement the diffusion model. As I said, I will be happy to address what is responsible for the contestation of human rights in South Korea as well as in other parts of the world. But I I provide the explanations for that question in my paper, so I'll be happy to address that if you have some questions. My paper is based on South Korean example, even though I maintain that my case is not limited to the South Korean case. It can be applicable to many other cases in the world, but it also requires the examination of other cases to be able to make my model more applicable to other situations and circumstances. I guess that's it. Thank you.